3 days in Yellowstone. The morning sun hung low over the Colorado foothills when Henry eased the old Ford F-150 out of the driveway. The chrome caught the light like a quiet promise of adventure. Margaret stood by the porch with Buddy at her feet, locking the front door and turning to wave at the house one last time. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and dew clinging to the world like a farewell hug. "Ready, sweetheart?" Henry called, one arm resting on the open window. Margaret smiled, tucking a strand of silver hair beneath her hat. "Born ready," she said, climbing in beside him. Buddy jumped into the back seat, tail thumping the leather with enthusiasm. The tires hummed against the asphalt as they rolled north, the mountains rising like ancient guardians on the horizon. They'd seen so much already: the endless plains of Kansas, the thunder of Niagara, the calm reflection of Salt Lake. But Yellowstone felt different. It wasn't a destination, Henry thought. It was something you felt, something wild and alive calling from the heart of the earth itself. "Do you think it'll smell like eggs?" Margaret teased, glancing up from the folded map in her lap. "Sulfur, you mean?" Henry chuckled. "That's what I heard. Hot springs, geysers, bubbling mud, a little perfume from Mother Nature." Margaret laughed. "Then it's a good thing I brought extra coffee." While they stopped at a roadside diner somewhere between the Utah border and southern Wyoming. The place had a big neon sign that flickered coffee and pie, and a waitress named Doris who looked like she'd been pouring coffee there since the 1970s. Henry ordered scrambled eggs and pancakes. Margaret went for oatmeal with honey and fresh fruit. Buddy waited patiently outside, watching trucks roll past the window. "You know," Margaret said between bites, "I think what I love most about these trips is how time slows down. No schedules, no alarms, no one rushing us." Henry nodded, stirring his coffee. "Yeah, feels like we finally caught up with ourselves." When they got back on the road, the landscape began to change. Wide open grasslands gave way to rolling hills and clusters of lodgepole pines. The clouds gathered and broke apart like sails in a sea of blue. They passed herds of cattle grazing lazily, windmills turning slow circles in the distance. By late afternoon, the signs started to appear. "Welcome to Yellowstone National Park." The letters looked weathered, carved deep into a wooden archway. Margaret reached out and rested her hand on Henry's arm. "We made it," she whispered. "Almost," he said. "Let's find that lodge before the sun sets." The road wound through dense forests and steaming vents that rose straight from the earth. It was like driving through another world, strange, ancient, breathing. Buddy pressed his nose to the window, whining softly as if he too could sense the life pulsing beneath them. When they reached the Yellowstone Lodge, the air smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. The building itself was all heavy beams and stone fireplaces, its windows glowing gold against the gathering dusk. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them. Laughter from the lobby, the crackle of fire, the faint tune of an old country song playing somewhere in the bar. Their room overlooked a meadow that stretched toward the tree line. Steam from a distant hot spring drifted across the field like a veil. Margaret stepped onto the balcony, breathing it in. "It's like the earth's exhaling," she murmured. Henry came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "Feels alive, doesn't it? Like it's watching us." They unpacked lightly. Just a change of clothes, a camera, and Margaret's worn leather journal. After a quick shower and a few minutes of Buddy's excited exploration around the room, they headed downstairs to the small restaurant by the lobby. The menu was simple: grilled trout, bison steak, and baked potatoes. Henry ordered a beer from a local brewery. Margaret asked for hot tea with lemon. The waiter, a college student with freckles and a bright smile, told them he'd grown up in Montana and that no sunset in the world beat the one over the Yellowstone River. He was right. After dinner, they walked down to the riverbank. The last light of day spread across the sky, lavender fading into orange, orange into blue. The water caught the color like glass, rippling softly as a cool breeze stirred. Buddy trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging. Margaret slipped her hand into Henry's. "You know," she said, "we've done a lot of miles since that first trip to the coast." "Yeah," Henry said quietly, "and I wouldn't trade a single one." For a while, they didn't talk. The world around them did all the speaking, the whisper of water, the distant call of an owl, the steady heartbeat of the land. When the first stars appeared, they turned back toward the lodge. The path was lit by lanterns hanging from wooden posts, their light swaying gently in the evening wind. Inside, a fire burned low in the lobby. A few guests sat reading or talking softly. Margaret bought 2 small enamel mugs from the gift shop, one painted with a bear, the other with a geyser bursting into the sky. "For the road," she said, handing one to Henry. He raised it like a toast. "To the wild heart." She smiled, clinking her mug against his, "and to never growing old." Buddy settled by the hearth as they sat together in the glow of the fire. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Somewhere in the dark distance, the ground hissed and bubbled, the quiet music of Yellowstone itself, welcoming them home for the night. Morning came softly to Yellowstone, the kind of dawn that didn't rush but stretched slow and golden across the meadows. Mist rose from the earth in thin ribbons, curling through the pine trees. The sound of distant bubbling springs echoed faintly, like coffee percolating somewhere deep underground. Margaret stood on the balcony, wrapped in a flannel blanket, a mug of steaming coffee in her hands. Down below, Buddy sniffed curiously at tufts of grass wet with dew, tail wagging in steady rhythm. Henry joined her, pulling on his old leather jacket and rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Smells like adventure," he said with a grin. "Smells like sulfur," she teased back, but her eyes sparkled. After a quick breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, and pancakes that tasted faintly of campfire smoke, they loaded the truck. The morning air was cool and alive, filled with bird calls and the distant rush of water. A ranger at the gate handed them a map, his beard flecked with frost. "Old Faithful's due to blow around 9:30, he said. "Don't blink, or you'll miss the show." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Henry replied, tipping his cap. They parked near the boardwalk and joined a quiet crowd already gathered around the great geyser. Steam drifted up in white ghosts that shimmered in the sunlight. The earth hissed and gurgled, restless, alive. When the eruption came, it was like the world exhaling. A column of boiling water burst skyward, catching the sun and turning into 1,000 glittering diamonds. Margaret gasped, squeezing Henry's arm. Buddy barked once, startled, then wagged his tail proudly as if he'd summoned the geyser himself. "Guess Old Faithful still keeps his word," Henry said with a smile. They lingered after the crowd drifted away, walking along the wooden walkways that twisted through the geothermal basin. Pools of impossible color spread out before them, sapphire blue, emerald green, and fiery orange where minerals met heat and light. Margaret knelt to take a picture, her reflection bending over the shimmering water. "It looks like someone painted the earth," she said softly. "Or maybe the earth's painting us," Henry replied. They followed a trail past the bubbling mud pots, thick gray stew that plopped and hissed like it had a bad sense of humor. Margaret wrinkled her nose. "Now that smells like eggs." Henry laughed. "You said it, not me." By late morning, they reached Grand Prismatic Spring. The air shimmered with heat, and the vast rainbow-colored pool lay before them like a dream. Steam rose in golden waves, wrapping them in a haze of warmth and color. Margaret stood still, speechless. Henry lifted his phone for a photo, but then lowered it again. "Some things," he murmured, "you just keep in your heart." They sat on a bench nearby, sharing a thermos of coffee and a bag of oatmeal cookies Margaret had packed. Buddy flopped down at their feet, content to nap in the patchy sunlight. Around them, the park pulsed with quiet life. Ravens circling overhead, the whisper of wind through tall grass, the gurgle of water beneath the earth. "You ever think," she said after a moment, "about how small we are out here?" Henry smiled, looking at the horizon. "Yeah, but it doesn't make me feel small. Makes me feel part of it." They drove north toward the lower falls of the Yellowstone River. The Grand Canyon of Yellowstone stretched before them, painted in layers of gold and rust and green. The roar of the falls filled the air, so loud it silenced every other thought. They leaned over the rail, watching the mist rise in great white plumes. "This," Henry shouted over the thunder, "beats television any day." Margaret laughed, her voice lost in the sound of falling water. She reached for his hand, and for a moment, time stopped. Just the two of them, the river and the eternal song of stone and steam. By afternoon, clouds began to gather. The sunlight softened, and a chill crept into the air. They stopped at a small park station where a ranger named Carl offered them hot chocolate and stories. Back in the day, he said, leaning on the counter, this place was called Coulter's Hell. The first folks who saw the geysers thought the devil himself was cooking soup underground. Henry chuckled. Guess the devil's got good taste in scenery. As the rain started to fall, they returned to their truck and headed toward Yellowstone Lake. The road wound through forests where elk grazed and buffalo moved like slow, living shadows. Margaret cracked open the window. The smell of wet pine and earth flooded in. When they reached the lake, the storm had passed. The water stretched out like glass, the sky reflected in perfect stillness. They found a quiet picnic spot by the shore. Margaret spread a blanket while Henry unpacked sandwiches and a small bottle of wine he'd been saving. Picnic by a volcano, she said, raising her brow. You sure know how to impress a lady. He poured her a glass. Hey, if the ground starts to rumble, at least we'll go out with a view. They clinked glasses, laughing, the sound echoing across the empty lake. Buddy splashed at the edge of the water, chasing his reflection. The sun dipped low, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The air cooled, and a quiet peace settled over everything. Henry leaned back on the blanket, hands behind his head. Remember our first road trip? He asked. You made sandwiches too, but you forgot the bread. I was testing your adaptability, she said with mock dignity. He chuckled, and I passed. They sat in silence for a long while, the world around them humming with life. Distant thunder, a hawk's cry, the whisper of reeds in the wind. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder. This place, she said softly, feels like the world before the world, untouched, alive. Henry nodded. That's the beauty of it. Makes you realize how lucky we are, to see it, to feel it, together. As twilight settled, they packed up and drove slowly back to the lodge. The headlights cut through the darkening woods, catching the eyes of a grazing elk for a brief, magical second. In the distance, steam rose from hidden pools, glowing faintly in the moonlight. When they arrived, the lodge was warm and welcoming. Guests gathered near the fireplace, drying jackets, sipping hot cider. Someone played a guitar softly, an old country tune about wide roads and open hearts. Margaret took Henry's hand. Dance with me, she said. He smiled. Right here, right here. They moved slowly, swaying to the music, their shadows flickering in the firelight. Buddy curled up nearby, sighing contentedly. Outside the park breathed its ancient rhythm, the heartbeat of Yellowstone, steady and eternal. The morning broke cool and clear, with thin fingers of mist curling between the lodgepole pines. The world smelled of pine needles, rain, and wood smoke, that crisp mountain perfume that seems to whisper, "Wake up, there's magic today." Henry was already outside when Margaret came down with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He stood by the truck, hands in his pockets, gazing at the pale blue horizon. Sleep? She asked. He chuckled. Barely. Something about knowing there are bears out there makes a man reconsider midnight snacks. Buddy barked once, tail wagging like he'd already volunteered as the official bear detector. They set out just after sunrise, the Ford's tires crunching on the gravel road. The day ahead was their third in Yellowstone, the one they'd been saving for the wild side. Their goal, to drive north through the Lamar Valley, the beating heart of the park's untamed world. As they rolled into the valley, the first thing they saw were the bison. Hundreds of them, massive, slow-moving shadows scattered across the misty plain. Some grazed, others rolled in the dust like giant shaggy dogs. Calves trotted clumsily beside their mothers. The earth seemed to hum beneath the weight of them. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh, Henry, they're beautiful." "Yeah," he whispered, like time never touched them. They pulled over to the roadside. Henry turned off the engine, and for a long while they just sat, watching the herd move like an ancient tide. One bison crossed right in front of their truck, so close they could hear the slow exhale from its nostrils. Buddy gave a low whine, tail still but eyes wide. Henry reached back to pat his head. "Easy, pal. That guy's older than both of us put together." A park ranger on a nearby ATV slowed down beside them, grinning through his sunglasses. "Morning, folks. Keep that window up. Big fellas like to investigate." Henry smiled. "Don't worry, officer. We're admirers, not participants." The ranger laughed and drove on, disappearing into the rolling fog. After the bison, the valley opened wide. golden meadows framed by distant blue ridges. A bald eagle circled overhead. Pronghorns darted through the sagebrush like ghosts of the plains. Margaret leaned out the window, her hair flying in the wind. "It's like driving through a painting," she said. Henry grinned. "And we're the lucky dots of color in it." They stopped at a turnout where a group of photographers had gathered, lenses pointed toward the tree line. Henry parked and joined them, curiosity sparking. "What's the show?" he asked a young woman with a long lens. "Grizzly," she whispered, "down by the riverbank." Henry followed her gaze. There in the distance was the unmistakable shape, a great brown bear, lumbering along the water's edge, nose low to the ground. The bear stopped, raised its head, and for a moment looked straight toward them. The air seemed to hold its breath. Margaret joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. "He's magnificent." Henry nodded slowly. "That's the word." When the bear finally moved on, disappearing into the trees, the crowd released a collective sigh, half relief, half reverence. Margaret smiled up at him. "Now that's one for the memory book." He chuckled. "And for the We Survived It chapter." They drove on toward Mammoth Hot Springs, winding through hills dotted with wildflowers. The travertine terraces spread out before them like frozen waterfalls, sculpted by centuries of mineral water. Steam drifted up from every crack and pool, carrying that familiar, sulfur-sweet scent. They walked the boardwalk in silence for a while. The terraces shimmered white and orange in the sun, water trickling down their sides in silver ribbons. Margaret stopped to watch a small herd of elk grazing lazily near the edge. "You know," she said softly, "it's strange. We call this wild, but it feels more patient than dangerous." Henry nodded. "Yeah, like the land knows we're visitors, and it's okay with that, as long as we behave." Buddy sniffed the air, then sat down obediently, as if agreeing. They found a picnic spot near a cluster of trees overlooking the terraces. Margaret laid out sandwiches, apple zap, and a thermos of lemonade. Henry leaned back on the bench, gazing at the horizon. "Do you ever think," he said, "how small our lives are compared to all this?" Margaret smiled. "Every time we travel somewhere like this, but maybe that's the point. Not to be big, just to see big." He looked at her, really looked. The way her eyes caught the light, the way time had softened but never dimmed her. "You've got the poet's soul, you know that?" "Comes with living next to yours," she teased. They clinked their cups, the ice in the lemonade chiming softly. A warm breeze swept through the pines, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. The day stretched before them like an open road. In the afternoon, they drove south toward the Hayden Valley, where the Yellowstone River curved like a blue ribbon through endless fields. They stopped at a lookout where a group of visitors watched a distant pack of wolves through spotting scopes. A ranger offered them a peek. Margaret leaned in, adjusting the focus, then gasped softly. "There they are, 2 of them." Henry looked too, gray shapes moving gracefully through the grass, wild, unbound, and ancient. "Imagine," she whispered, "what they've seen, the stories this land keeps." He nodded slowly. "Makes me wonder what stories it'll tell after we're gone." As the sun began to dip, the sky turned gold, then orange, then deep rose. Shadows stretched across the valley like slow-moving clouds. The world felt hushed, sacred, a cathedral without walls. They pulled into a small lodge near Grant Village, the air cool and smelling faintly of pine smoke. The porch lights flickered on one by one as twilight deepened. Inside, a small bar offered chili, cornbread, and local craft beer. Henry raised his glass. "To the wild ones, all of them." Margaret smiled, clinking her mug gently against his. "And to us, the slightly less wild ones." Buddy sighed, curling up under the table, his tail thumping once before sleep claimed him. Outside, the night came softly, filled with the calls of distant coyotes and the endless whisper of wind through the trees. The park settled into darkness, alive and eternal, holding its secrets close, waiting for morning to wake again. The next morning broke soft and golden, the kind of dawn that feels like it was made just for travelers. The mountains of Yellowstone glowed pink at their peaks, while thin threads of fog drifted lazily over the meadows. Henry brewed coffee on the lodge's porch while Margaret packed sandwiches, humming a tune Buddy seemed to recognize. His tail swayed in perfect rhythm. "Hard to believe it's our last day here," she said, closing the cooler. Henry nodded slowly. "Feels like this place stretches time. 3 days feel like 3 weeks in the best way." They loaded up the F-150, Buddy hopping in with a bark that echoed across the valley. The old truck hummed to life, its tires rolling over the wet gravel, heading south toward the Grand Teton National Park, the final stop on their journey before the long road home. The morning air was cool, the kind that fills your lungs like mountain wine. As they crossed into the Tetons, the landscape seemed to rise around them, sharp peaks cutting into the blue sky, rivers curling like silver ribbons between pines. Margaret leaned forward, eyes wide. "It's breathtaking," Henry smiled. "Now that's a word we've been using a lot lately. Might need to start rationing it." "Not when it's this," she said, gesturing at the towering ridges. "This is the kind of view that makes you forget to breathe altogether." They stopped at Jenny Lake, the water a perfect mirror of the sky and snow-tipped mountains. The air was still except for the soft rustle of aspens and the distant cry of an eagle. Henry sat on a rock near the shore, his reflection joining the peaks on the lake's surface. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think peace was something you found at home. Now I'm not so sure." Margaret sat beside him, pulling her sweater tighter. "Maybe peace isn't a place, Henry. Maybe it's a way of seeing, the way you look at me, the way you look at these mountains." He smiled, that quiet, grateful smile she knew so well. "Guess that's one more thing to thank you for." They walked along the shoreline path, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot and Buddy splashing joyfully at the edge of the water. Families passed by, hikers with walking sticks, young couples with cameras. Everyone seemed quieter here, as if the mountains themselves commanded a kind of reverence. By midday, clouds gathered, painting shadows over the slopes. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone. They decided to stop at a small cafe near Jackson Lodge, the kind of place with wooden benches, flannel curtains, and coffee that could wake a bear from hibernation. A waitress with silver hair and a Teton Lodge badge smiled warmly. "Passing through?" she asked. "Yeah," Henry said. "Been up in Yellowstone for a few days, heading home soon." She nodded knowingly. "You'll carry it with you, though. This place, it sticks to people." Margaret laughed softly. "I think it already has." They ate bowls of bison stew, thick and savory, served with warm bread. Outside the window, the peaks loomed, their tops brushing the clouds. It felt like being inside a painting, framed by glass, but still alive. After lunch, they drove up to Signal Mountain Overlook, winding through the forest until the trees opened to a sweeping panorama of the Tetons and the Snake River Valley below. The world seemed endless, a sea of gold and green under a sky streaked with light. Margaret stepped out, wrapping her scarf as the wind tugged playfully at it. "You can see forever from up here." Henry came beside her, arms slipping around her shoulders. "Yeah, and still the best part's right next to me." Buddy barked, as if in agreement, his fur rippling in the breeze. They lingered there for a long time, just watching the clouds drift over the peaks, the sunlight spilling and fading like a slow heartbeat. It was one of those moments that didn't need words, the kind that stitched itself quietly into memory. Later, as the sun began to sink, they reached the edge of Jackson Hole. The valley spread wide and glowing, fields brushed in amber, cattle grazing by old wooden fences, and beyond them, the town of Jackson, its wooden saloons and neon signs flickering to life. They parked near the famous antler arches of the town square. The air buzzed softly with country music from a nearby bar, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Margaret looked around, charmed. "It's like walking into an old Western movie." Henry grinned. "All we need now is a cowboy hat and a slow walk into the sunset." They bought a couple of souvenirs, a carved wooden bison for their mantle and a small bandana for Buddy, embroidered with Jackson Hole WI. The dog seemed oddly proud of it. As evening settled, they found a bench facing the mountains. The last light painted the Tetons in shades of rose and violet. Margaret leaned her head on Henry's shoulder. "You think we'll ever see all there is to see?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, but that's the beauty of it. There's always another road." They sat there in silence as the sky deepened to indigo, stars beginning to shimmer one by one. The air turned crisp, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifted from a nearby lodge. Henry squeezed her hand. "Tomorrow we'll head home," she smiled, "and start dreaming of the next place." Buddy sighed contentedly, curling at their feet as the night wrapped around them like an old blanket. In the distance, Coyotes called, lonely, wild, and free. The Tetons stood silent and eternal, holding the last light of the day across their ridges. For Henry and Margaret, it felt like the world itself had paused, letting them breathe, remember, and simply be. The road ahead would wait till morning. But for now, this peace, this stillness, this love was enough.